Now, I think the topic for today is very important, personally, but it's also one which is more discussive than it is based in physical law. But if you stick with me for just a moment, it will all make sense. It's nothing complex, and this topic is pretty easy to get straight to the heart of things, but I do want to be clear from the outset that the framing of this discussion is not focused on any one change or singular update that's been made to the law. And in terms of this, I'm thinking about a time window of the past 5 or 10 years. And I think we can realise quite easily how there are some revelations, changes, elements of the 40k verse, which remain, no matter how somebody may feel individually about, just more contentious and subjectively problematic. But what triggered me into thinking about all of this and what we're talking about is in terms of how jarring new additions can be, especially when it comes to people's long journey in building a sense of what is more true to exist in the galaxy of M41. It was those new guard vehicles, and specifically the descriptions that go with them, which brought me to this point. But before I get into all of that, I will say thank you for joining me once again, but also, if you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider this. I rarely mention it, but as I am finally on the home straight for 1 million subscribers, and whilst not technically something I ever set out to achieve, it would be just a nice thing to get as a YouTube creator. So if you're not already subbed and you do follow the channel, please hit that one for me. It makes a huge difference for the channel in terms of the algorithm, along with likes and so on. Now, I do also want to quickly make a small corrective amendment announcement off the back of my last video, because if you didn't know, in the past month I welcomed my second child to the world. It's one of the reasons why I sound like crap and I'm so run down. But even in the run-up to that happening, my state of focus was, let's just say, scattered, to say the least. I think this is why in the last video, when I spoke about the new vehicles with their mythical naming conventions, hippogriff, etc., my brain decided to just entirely blank the extremely obvious fact that the vast swath of Imperial vehicles already bear names like Manticore, Chimera, and so on, despite the fact as well that literally in front of me right now on the shelf are 2 boxes which say Manticore on the side of them. So I hope you can appreciate this was a rare, complete mental blank for me. I know many people commented about it. I'm sorry you had to. It's absurd that I slipped up on that one. Anyway, just wanted to acknowledge that. But back to today. So essentially what I want to focus on talking about is not should X thing be a part of 40k or not. Each case for such things can be made and likely have been at length across innumerable social platforms. What I want to talk about is how the implementation of such things impacts the wider context of the law. And I want to underscore how big a deal that is for me anyway, because it's more important than just new thing arrives. And this is primarily because I think we are reaching a disturbing point where we may be standing in a position and have no other option than to presume some kind of full reset has occurred in terms of the law standing when it comes to Imperial technology. In short, if you had to ask me today, I would say that I now unfortunately have to hold the position that the idea that STC are the primary method of technology pattern discovery for the Imperium no longer holds any weight. In some respects, I'm not happy about this. In another, it does sort of make sense. In relation to this, for the longest time, whenever I saw people stating, well, isn't it likely that somebody on X planet is just out there inventing stuff? Humans aren't going to just forget how to do that. In some respects, that's not correct because of the education factor in terms of the Imperium and the state of the culture. And so my response was generally, well, maybe, but probably not, and inevitably the Mechanicus would just then shut them down later, or the Inquisition. It's going to stay planet localized, it's not going to spread beyond that point, because if that happens they're going to face really severe consequences. While that may still be true, I feel the needle now has shifted on the acceptance and the emergence of new things. And I say this quite simply because it appears that GW just no longer seem to be particularly concerned about providing suitable descriptions for the background of new things that give us their relevant lore context in terms of origin and history. It used to be pretty default that when you got basically the statement about whatever the thing was which was arriving, and there has been plenty which has arrived over the last 10 or longer years, you would basically get, oh, so-and-so found this on a planet in such date, etc., etc., or, well, we haven't seen too many of these because of X reason, but now they're being used more, blah, blah, blah. Something like that. And again, you might think that's a very small, irrelevant detail, but for me anyway, it helps contextualize things and it helps things slot into the existing world, which to me is pretty important because it's maintaining that immersion, that in-fiction, which is how I see 40k. In both instances, though, of the new vehicles for the Guard, Hippogriff and the Centaur, the language describing them does so as if they have always existed. And you might think that's a trend that we are now starting to see. Hey, here's a thing. Oh, by the way, didn't you know that was always here? Now, I was lucky enough to see a preview version of the new Yarrick books. Sometimes I get previews like this, and I can say that when it comes to the brief paragraphs which describe the Hippogriff and the Centaur, the description focuses heavily on words which contextualize them as having always existed but without explicitly saying so. It talks about them vaguely as existing in abundance, being relied upon, favoured for certain tactical doctrines and so on. Basically no specific references at all to their origins, but making it absolutely clear that, trust me bro, they were always there. Now, as I said, I'm not focused on specific editions today, but similarly to something like the female Custodes, which I have already talked about, the implementation is what I take issue with. Because when you have new characters like this Commissar Graves, whose lore background is similarly bonkers, I think they just kind of, with Graves, they were like, well, she has to kind of step up to the plate. She's got to kind of be in the mix when Yarrick's beside there as well. So they went way over the top. It actually kind of works for 40k, but her description, which you'll learn of later, is just bonkers. Basically, she's just killing people left, right and centre on the mildest pretext, and it's just mad. You've also got Inquisitor Croyle, this sort of peacocking, flamboyant, noble Inquisitor. The fact you've never seen these figures before, it's not really the issue, because at a human level in a verse as wide and chaotic as the Imperium, encountering people you've never seen or heard of until a specific point is just basically a given. There's probably more characters who have existed for decades and you equally haven't heard of, in honesty, unless you're just masterfully well-read on 40k lore. But with that said, when it comes to heavily established factions, suddenly noting, oh, that? Yeah, that was always there. Didn't you notice? It's so neck-breakingly jarring. But as I will note later, there is even ways that you can write around that, should you really want to. I just can't honestly imagine why, because there's so many innumerable preferable ways to introduce new things and still have it sit comfortably with the audience. And that comfort with the lore is really what I take issue with, and seemingly many others do. Because as you know at this point, I enjoy things, as I say, to be delivered in a contextually plausible in-fiction manner, not just, bang, this is here now. Consider the best example of Call. While some of his creations may be a bit flat, overall Belisarius Call as a character works, and so do the arrival of the things he brought to the table. It's not been an easy journey, but I feel now most people just accept Call, even enjoy him, because of the writing and his character. And as I said in the most recent video where I gave that overview of Call and his story to this point, it's pretty epic, and his recent arguments with other members of the Mechanicus was very strong when it comes to establishing his rationale in terms of producing new technology. Not only that, but he's also backed by Guilliman, which, again, makes sense. You might imagine that if Guilliman was not around, Call would be facing much more significant consequences and censure, even if the immediate effect was significantly detrimental to the Imperium in terms of not having the things that Call is trying to do. But with Guilliman effectively giving Call license for heresy, in terms of technology anyway, there are very few limits upon him. Now I think we all know it's certain the Primarch wouldn't approve of everything Call is up to, and he even states that himself with his typically dark humour, but the Guilliman get-out-of-jail-free card does enable Call to throw new things into the mix and take on tasks that others would be far too scared to, plus the added benefit of it not feeling jarring to us via dissociative lore. In stark contrast to that, you've got the new guard vehicles arriving with basically no references to their origin other than, they're stalwart, they're well-trusted guard vehicles, they're used broadly, but also you've just never seen them before. Why? Don't worry about that, my friend, you best stick to your work. And you might say, well, come on, Luton, they're just vehicles, it doesn't really matter, whatever. I can't deal with it. It feels like a gut punch in terms of acceptable lore delivery to me. It really bothers me. Is it something that makes me want to just tip over a table and abandon 40k? No, that would be stupid, especially for something I've basically invested 30 years of myself into. But it does feel unnecessarily blunt. And I will say, for the people who always fail to sincerely engage with my rationale that canonicity is not a thing in 40k, and who say, oh, so by Luton's logic, we can just invent anything, anytime, add it to 40k. No. I've been very clear all the way. The answer to that is both yes and no. You just have to sincerely engage with the concept and the parameters and not be silly about it. The idea of what is, if you want to use the term canon in 40k, leans heavily on what is already established. It's really not that complicated. In essence, the way I view things is, if something has been widely referenced for a long time from official sources, not just anybody making up whatever they want, if it's well established through multiple first and second-hand sources across novels, campaign material, and the like, then you can be pretty sure that is a thing which exists in the verse. It doesn't mean you can just wake up one day and find out that, oh wow, Space Marine Terminators were never a thing. It was all just warp shenanigans. No. They're very heavily embedded and evidenced in the lore, so that is a thing, we can know it is there. At the same time, does it mean that you couldn't get rid of Terminators in the lore? Absolutely not. You could very easily rationalize by any number of formats that happening. Some edict from Guilliman, maybe they lose the tech, the STC, and on and on. There are so many ways that you could do it. Why would you want to? I have no idea. You never would want to, but you could. And all I'm trying to say is there's a plausible way to make things happen or change. It doesn't mean just throwing into thin air new things or erasing others without warning. It also doesn't mean you have to be happy about a change. Things can change and you can still be unhappy with it. You don't like it doesn't make sense to you, whatever. That can happen. But arguing about if it can or can't happen, that is not the way. You cannot really argue with that because of just the way the 40k verse is structured. And that's really the core, the meat of what I'm trying to get to. And again, this is why recently some of the things that were most jarring were things like the female Custodes reveals. It wasn't their existence per se, it was the way it was done. If they'd introduced this change 20 years ago with some rationalization, I guarantee nobody would have really raised an eyebrow. But after so much time reinforcing references about Custodes, brotherhood and so on, and basically also just being men everywhere, suddenly turning that upside down was jarring, neck-breakingly jarring. But even then, it need not have been. If they'd have gone with anything other than, trust me mate, they were always there, it wouldn't have felt like such a slap in the face. What if through a nice, maybe gritty, well-written exploratory novel which delves into the darker depths of the Imperial Palace, something there was found as an experimental part of the Emperor's creation process for the Custodes deep below, and it turned out this was his intention all along. There was always the call factor as well. Basically, you don't need to go down the list, there are ways which you can make stuff happen. There's just tons of other options than, yeah, this was always a thing, also don't ever ask us about it again, and it's definitely not related to an Amazon series requirement. In terms though of trusting lore, other things like Kerr's and Sanguinius' visions, they saw them, they believe them, they're part of the lore. But whether what they see is solid or not is unknowable. And the point is that whilst we can know those are the things they saw, only they can directly really relate to those things. It can't inform other elements because we can't rely on that. Beyond dreams and visions, you've got more broadly innumerable campaigns of the Imperium out among the galaxy. You've got all the side quests of the Cabal and stuff like this. You've got strange characters appearing in short stories who vanish never to be seen again. They could be AI, they could be relics of the Dark Age of technology or not. All of these little details you can't be sure for certain to base solid references to those things because they usually only appear in a singular instance. You may be able to make a passing mention of it, or if there were characters with some kind of common theme within them that were appearing here and there, you might be able to connect all those things together. But my rule is usually, if it's singularly mentioned in one place, you can't really rely on it. It has to be more broadly evidenced. And if you want to be more blunt about canonicity, or even the retcon word in 40k, it's more that the galaxy itself is so chaotic that something which happens in one place or one reference can be so easily contradicted or completely overwritten later. It's hard to trust things. It's not about wanting to or not, it's just hard to trust things. And this doesn't even mean that were a major or small change to happen, that you define that necessarily as a retcon. That's why I always am reticent to use that word. It just means that the original information you were using was never secure enough to be considered canon in terms of it being locked in and immovable. And that just further supports the whole idea of established parameters in events in 40k being more fluid than in other fictional verses. And lastly, I just want to remind that this is backed up, albeit somewhat indirectly, by actual 40k authors' statements over the years, that in essence, canonicity in the typical way we imagine it is not a thing in 40k. 40k is just this melting pot of ideas, and everything kind of establishes itself through weight of superiority over time. And as I've said, in many ways, I'd love to have everything locked down, tied to dates, and clearly labelled. And with that specifically in mind, I'm not at all happy lately about things becoming even more vague. Dropping M dates for additional lore material is not a positive for me. If you go through any of the newer campaign material, codexes, things like this, you will struggle to find an M date anywhere. They've basically stopped referencing that now, and that is just, it's going to be so problematic years down the line when people are trying to make some kind of chronological sense of things. But I also respect the verse, and I prefer to see things, as I say, from this in-fiction perspective. In that sense, you can't just ignore the fact that the galaxy of 40k, from the Heresy to M41, is riddled with extreme levels of corruption and manipulation and propaganda. There are certainly pros and cons to both the in-fiction perspective and the external position for ourselves from the 40k verse, not least that it allows an almost unique level of adjustment and manipulation by the writers, which, intentional or not, has become a surprisingly foolproof way of changing things around without necessarily having to declare it a devastating retcon. It doesn't mean people will still be happy about it, but it can technically mean things can change without that being done entirely externally, like you might see with stuff like Star Wars or Doctor Who, where they basically just said, stick it in the bin and set fire to decades of established material, which is not only absolutely insane, but they have very clearly paid the price for that. So far in 40k, the biggest changes made were ones people seem to be not particularly fussed about, which I think speaks volumes about really how sincerely people might talk about this issue, or if it's just certain specific changes they dislike at some personal level. The classic Necron lore change many years ago was massive back in the day, but it's never really sparked the seething outrage or calls for a return to the original veins of their narrative that you might see now. More recently, there was the shifts made with the Dark Imperium trilogy. That was one of the biggest changes which has occurred in recent times, and I've mentioned this before, but essentially they just reset things heavily in terms of dates and events as to Guilliman's Crusade, the Indomitus time, the timings of the Rift and what happened thereafter. In this instance also, I do think it was actually necessary, and the fact that it could be done without ripping everything apart because of how 40k is structured as we just outlined, supported such a huge shift around surprisingly well. And I think that's why you didn't see people losing their mind about it and 100 videos with people foaming at the mouth saying, this is the end of 40k, they've ruined the Dark Imperium trilogy. You didn't have any of that really, because that very significant update became pretty much little more than a footnote, despite the fact it vastly overhauled the timeline of contemporary Imperial events. From what I recall, people just basically accepted it. It was barely a single day's news because it ultimately changed little in the broader context other than the order of events, but objectively, it was a big deal. It just also wasn't neck-breakingly jarring. Because other shifts that are admittedly less significant, even down to adding in a couple of new guard transports does feel more jarring. And it's simply down to one thing that I never stop talking about, and that is its context. Now, for any who says I don't do my research, I wanted to point out that there is, in fact, a precedent for the hippogriff, or sort of, anyway. You see, back in the days of the glorious second edition of 40k, things were a little more loose around the edges. Conversions were welcome, you often even saw these in official material, which would be almost unimaginable, although it is starting to come back a little on the edges these days. Alongside official publications like White Dwarf, you also had supplements like the Citadel Journal. And there was, in 1996, a small 2-page article which decided to provide rules for some custom-built Imperial Guard recon vehicles, which were obviously based around World War II platforms. These were called the Centaur and the Minotaur. This article is problematic, not only because the later Forge World Krieg tractor would also be called a Centaur, but because this is the issue GW has, and the crux of my whole discussion when it comes to lore, STC, and canonicity. You see, the Centaur and Minotaur in this article could have just provided rules for some custom vehicles and be done with it. But instead, they decided to, or more correctly, probably got authorized to provide a bit of lore, but it would have been just written on the fly, as was typical. And the thing is, it's never really been suggested anywhere since then that this doesn't stand even today. It's likely because they were never mentioned in 30 years, and because they never had official models other than these converted ones. Nonetheless, the material is written as lore in an official publication, therefore, unless contradicted, it stands. So the issue now is, if this stuff is still good, why wasn't it mentioned at all with the new vehicles, the arrival of the Hippogriff, which is very obviously a descendant of these early versions? And that's even because the article describes how the development of the Centaur for the Imperial Guard created a family of vehicles. It talks about the role of Imperial Guard recon units, that the Guard tried modified versions of Chimera and Lehman Russ, but these were too slow, so they developed these scout vehicles using, quote, the powerful Lehman Russ engine was fitted into a shortened Chimera chassis, while a 4-wheel drive system gave the stability and maneuverability required. The Centaur was easily capable of outrunning all but the very fastest of vehicles, and make those that could keep up seriously regretted. The Centaur has given birth to a whole family of variants, one of the better known being the Minotaur. Like me, you might be thinking, hold on, this sounds a lot like heresy. Heresy in my Imperial Guard. Free-thinking vehicle development based on necessity, not wholly STC? It even goes on to state, since its conception, the Centaur family has become a common sight on battlefields of the 41st millennium, not only in the reconnaissance role, but as a light tank, giving vital close support to foot troops. Squadrons of Centaurs have already been used for raids behind enemy lines, hunting command posts, ammo and fuel dumps and artillery positions. To which you say, the what? The conception? The conception of the Centaur family? A random human thought up how to make a vehicle? The tech priests are just vomiting on the floor oil and coolant right now. But this is my point overall. There's a bizarre irregularity in lore when it comes to STC, but also specifically to these vehicles. The idea of somebody just creating a vehicle for the Guard is head-exploding. And the fact they decided not to continue on with this bizarre tangent from 1996, reframe it whatever, instead going with the generic, yeah, they've always existed framing, is a curious one. Now, as we'll get to later, I made a community post for you guys to contribute your thoughts about this topic, and I'm going to cover a couple of those later on. But one of the common opinions I saw was along the lines of, well, this was always a thing, it's just how 40k is in terms of these new Guard vehicles, which I really don't accept, unfortunately, because for the longest time there were technically solid rules about how the Imperium acquired its technology. There were strict applications as to how new equipment would appear. A new tank, for example, should at least be described in some sense as having had its STC discovered after some event or location. At the very least, the implication that it worked upon an STC format, the Macarius tanks are a good example of what we should expect. In stark contrast to something like the Rogel Dawn, which appeared with very little information about how that came into being. But I think the Rogel Dawn got a pass in that regard simply because it's a pretty epic looking tank. It's also a fantastic kit to build. But the new tanks for the Guard we've seen lately have been framed with language which makes them sound as if they were always in use for millennia. And if you missed that, that's on you, which I really do find irritating. You don't have to frame them that way. You could simply state how they were rediscovered, and although their STC template was a more basic variant of an adjacent vehicle like the Taurox, or for example on Necromunda, the Tauros Venator, the simplicity of their design meant that by mid-M41 their production had exploded and now they've become an integral transport platform for the Guard. What's wrong with that? You can essentially crowbar them in, but just make it have a little more sense than, yeah, we never mentioned it, but yeah, they're everywhere. Again, the Macarius. I believe it arrived somewhere around the end of the 4th edition of 40k, but the lore didn't catch up until the mid or end of 5th edition, and finally it was referenced in detail, their origin and STC basis, and that was extremely well written into the Imperial Armor books. And it made perfect sense. You can easily accept it because it's written in a way which slots it into the in-fiction verse. And it's not really more complicated than that. I think it also demonstrates that you don't necessarily have to rush the specific explanations for the background either. In many ways, I'd be happy if there was no explanation, if it was just like, yeah, these are coming in this new box set, and then a little bit down the line you get padded information about them. So instead you could start with just smaller lore references, in-fiction fragments which fill out the sidebars of a codex or campaign books. Such and such was found after a long campaign which saw 2 hive cities destroyed, etc. Now, I don't really particularly care what the origin of X thing would be. Rightly, many of you have pointed out that in a galactic empire, there will be obviously some vehicles localized to certain areas, numerous different points of origin, including but not necessarily limited to being STC based. The problem is that within the lore of 40k, STCs are not just some token throwaway mention as to the way technology works. They are, and remain, established that any technology produced outside of the management and the oversight of the Mechanicus, i.e. those who did not adhere to the holy cult of the machine, would face the brutal judgment of the Prefecture Magisterium. Essentially, it's not to suggest that random vehicles or other tech doesn't exist, it's more the question of how long will that remain under the radar of the Mechanicus, and that could even extend to, say, a commander or an inquisitor makes use of such technology to get whatever campaign they're managing concluded, but for the Imperial Guard, who are supplied by Forge Worlds, to be using broadly a vehicle that isn't based on an STC format should be essentially impossible. Now, that's not to suggest that new vehicles will not have an STC origin reference later as per the Macarius. It's very possible that we will see that with those new Guard vehicles, and I imagine that they may well do that later on through other campaigns, supplementary material, whatever. But this isn't the issue, and it isn't what avoids it being jarring, because the language which has been used initially in how these have been presented to us is that these things exist for a long time. But they've done that without any supporting material of since X campaign, or describing them being used more heavily since a certain date or since a discovery, and that's what feels off. Also, if you've not heard of the Prefecture Magisterium before, I don't blame you, because that's barely mentioned anywhere, but it is technically still a thing. They're effectively the Inquisition for the Mechanicus, and they're charged with preserving dogma, persecuting heretics, remember that's tech with a T-E-K. They're said to exist on all Forge Worlds, but little more is known of them, plus the reference is from the time of the heresy, so there's a bit of a question mark there. Again, this is a flawless example of how you cannot necessarily trust whether certain things are still around, still exist in terms of the lore, just because it was referenced long ago. But the Mechanicus tend to change less than other departments of the Imperium, so it's very possible those are still a thing. In the more recent Warhammer crime novels, especially Flesh and Steel, we saw an example of perhaps an equivalent contemporary character to that department, Row 1 Lux, who belonged to the Collegiate Extremis, who are also a group within the Mechanicus who hunt down any who are accused of tech heresy. Still, the point is, the existence of these groups notwithstanding, it has become readily apparent that over the decades the view of, if it's not STC, it's not getting made, has softened. To the point where, like I said now, it seems almost anything goes. And as I said earlier, the continued existence of Belisarius Call alone makes that readily apparent. Although saying that Call continues to be, as far as we know, more of an exception and not the norm. In fact, it's very questionable if anyone could achieve what Call has done, for he really does stand as a unique individual. When it comes to STC and also the concept of canonicity, I feel we can carry on without needing to drag through it all, but I do think it's worthwhile to just remember that as much as we discuss new vehicles for the Guard, such things are introduced in this deliberately vague manner, and that I think is hard to argue as being anything other than quite clearly by design, which ties into also that reduction of references to the M dates. I think essentially when it comes to context, there may have been some kind of conclusion made that the 40k galaxy is becoming too complex in terms of the amount of events, discoveries, and so on, which are all locked to specific dates, events, times, places, because for writers I would imagine this becomes a minefield, having to continually cross-reference vast amounts of previous lore and cross-check that. It's understandably challenging. But understandable or not, I'm not sure it's any better to start making things increasingly vague with no clear tie to any kind of chronology, no matter how screwed up Imperial time archiving is. And as I always say, context is everything. But more specifically, context is acutely problematic for the Imperium, because with other factions in 40k, you just don't have the same issues. The Necrons, Votan or Tau, I'll speak to this more soon, but they don't adhere to some religious machine cult who dictate what can and can't be made. It's incredibly easy to just say with basically any other faction in 40k, oh yeah, they've got this now. Why? They invented it. They rediscovered it. They reverse engineered it. They made a less or better version of something they found. Basically anything you like. And it's all 100% fine because they're not bound by the rules of the cult Mechanicus. And the Mechanicus are the ones producing the bulk of hardware for the Imperium. Basically, if you didn't have their doctrine strangling the Imperium, things would be very different. But that isn't the case, and so you have this situation where new things coming out of thin air feels extraordinarily jarring, gaslighty, and in general, you need to strongly justify where this new thing that we haven't seen before came from and how it fits in. Because trust me, it's always been there, isn't cutting it. So with that in mind, it's the Imperium are the ones facing this issue acutely compared to these other factions. And it's not just the new Guard vehicles either. There's been a swath of other new units, even Titan variants like the Direwolf Scout Titans, which are on the more acceptable side of things being effectively just a variant of a Warhound, but nonetheless they're new, alongside the Titan you may never have heard of, the Warmaster Heavy Battle Titan, and again, like I said, you got stuff like the Rogal Dawn. You've also got this new Bellatus Pattern Knight, which arrived very recently. Same situation, where basically its described role and tactical capabilities, but nothing about how or why this thing is suddenly present when it was not before. But nothing about how or why this thing is suddenly present when it was not before. When the Warmaster Battle Titan arrived, many people rightly felt, well wait a minute, there's now a different Titan, it's not a Warlord or an Imperator, and we've never seen or heard anything about this before? And you might think, well that fits into this format of something being pretty jarring, and I felt the same initially. Except that when they actually went into the background of how the Warmaster Titan came into the narrative, and also the fact that Adeptus Titanicus was set in the heresy period, not the contemporary M41 time, things made more sense. Because the Warmaster is basically described in the supporting material as appearing before the Imperium, but remaining a closely guarded secret by the Mechanicum even until the late Horus Heresy, due to its rarity and extreme devastating power. Now, That's a great opening for introducing something new. It fits within the factional lore, and it's very believable for the Mechanicum to just keep something like this under wraps. And so this is a perfect example of how if you want to bring something in and you write contextually well thought out material, you can just accept it and say, yeah, sure, that works. Now, I think if this was being released now, they'd have probably just left it at that. They'd have just said, oh yeah, the Mechanicum always had this, but they just didn't want to roll it out until now. But yeah, they were always around. Well, that's not where they left it. It said that they were distributed across Forge Worlds in the galaxy, but in very small numbers. They were essentially an ace card Titan to pull out once a home planet's existence was at stake. That's why you never saw them. The first open use of Warmaster Titans, therefore, quite correctly, came during the Heresy in the Schism of Mars, when everything is on the line. The Warmaster's deployment saw entire Titan maniples being destroyed by this singular titanic monstrosity. But they also noted that there were those like the infamous Legio Mortis who were seen to reveal a hidden, larger stock of Warmaster Titans which caused untold devastation for loyalists. And the lore even rationalizes this, given that Mortis had acquired a number of Warmaster due to their allegiance with Kelbor Hal, the then traitor Fabricator General of Mars. One of the easiest ways for them to still be vague about such a war machine is in observing that the exact number of Warmaster Titans, which existed prior to the Heresy, remained unknown. Totally plausible, but that even for the more powerful Legio, they were still only able to field a handful. For example, the well-known Legio Griffonicus and Legio Crucius only having 3 and 2 Warmaster respectively. So it's not expanded upon, but the fact that Warmasters are not seen commonly or even all in the contemporary setting of M41 makes perfect sense, given their already extreme rarity in the Heresy. So 10,000 years later, if any Warmaster do exist, they are likely singular exceptions confined to the vaults of Legios or the Mechanicus. Now, I wanted to include this because it is for me an example of a perfect inclusion of how you create the background for a new machine of war to be placed into the lore for the Imperium. They're rare already in the Heresy, they're unlikely to be seen in M41, it works perfectly for that game system based in that era. Now, for the more contemporary machines, that is more difficult, but there are many options as to how they could appear. Basically, anything though other than just in a tone of it's been in use for millennia, we just never mentioned it. More importantly though, as I said in the end of the last section, this is a problem which does exist exclusively really for the Imperium, and given that, you'd think this would be something that would be at the forefront of introducing any new technical assets for the Imperium or Guard, whereas the Tau can basically introduce anything new as and when they want, because it's the Tau. They got zero restrictions on their ability to invent. Similarly, the likes of the Orc or the Tyrannid, anything goes basically. Chaos, the same. They can just pull whatever they want out because they've got the Dark Mechanicum and the Infinite Void. The Eldar, I think, are a little more restrictive, as are the Necron, only because to a degree it's presumed basically we've seen what they've got at this point. However, both should theoretically be more than capable of producing something new should they need or choose to, or rationalizing they find an ancient vault of objectively new war machines, the Eldar maybe in the Webway, because they've got literally millions of years behind them. So I think it would be very absurd to suggest that they couldn't have just misplaced something spectacular in that time, or find a way to reuse something they found in stasis from the War in Heaven, and so on. Basically, you probably give anything new for the Necron or the Eldar a bit of a pass. It's probably plausible. So all the other factions are pretty solid, but the Imperium is a different matter. Now again, without restating everything, it's because they got these strict rules, not to mention the fact that Guilliman regardless, the Imperium is still meant to be in a horrifying state of stagnation and decline. Yeah, you've got the Primaris, you've got Guilliman back, you've got new, more forward-moving things happening, but that doesn't mean that the entire Imperium across the galaxy suddenly just turns on the light and everything's good. The Imperium as a galactic civilization remains in this terrifying decline, this horrifying decay. So unlike these other factions, when the Imperium just whips out a shiny new vehicle that nobody's seen before, it's like, whoa, what? There's immediate whiplash. And that's combined with their religious doctrine of nothing without an STC. Or if it's some other procurement, i.e. Primaris, it better have Guilliman's personal seal no matter where it's come from. And it's not to say that there aren't ways around it. Just off the top of my head, how about lost STC discovered? Maybe the tech was in use for a long time, but only on peripheral worlds. Now a single notable campaign demonstrated its use, and so the Guard say, hey, let's broadly implement this. We get a new Mechanicus character who decides he's going to similarly, maybe he's heard about Call, and so he decides he's going to buck the trend, starts not necessarily creating new things, but giving some Mechanicus official mark to random creations on Imperial worlds. He's a bit of a maverick, perhaps forging their status. Lost technology, another classic similar to the Warmaster. Maybe it was used in the Crusade, fell out of fashion, too complex like some of the other tech. Maybe a Forge World or a Rogue Trader finds some key to resurrecting it, and quickly this is approved for use throughout the Imperium, and that's how you would describe it. You would say, well, up until a certain time this wasn't being used, but now it's been, spreading quickly through the Guard. Lastly, you can still just do the, hey, it was always a thing, but just be more creative and get around it by describing something like, the Hippogriff found itself barely mentioned in the historical records of the Administratum due to its use mainly within hive cities for RBTs or operations and local security duties. In recent centuries, though, the Imperial Guard have found the Hippogriff ever more viable for its flexible role and ease of deployment in a broad spectrum of operations. Now, if I had more time and inclination, I could polish all of these up with a ton more detail, but I'd take really any of these over, yeah, it's always been here, didn't you notice? But let's see what some of you all thought about the new machines and their context for the Imperium. Before my final thoughts, I decided to grab some of your opinions, and I sometimes will post a question for the channel under the Posts tab here. So if you don't, be sure to check there periodically if you'd like, as sometimes I do post polls and other things. There were also a lot of good comments made, and I obviously can't include them all, so have a read through if you want to. Overall, I think the consensus is pretty much as you'd expect, but it's always good to see things confirmed by a bulk of opinion. Essentially, the views are 40k is a huge verse, and so it only makes sense that innumerable vehicle types exist, and then you've also got the classic, well, this is how things have always been, don't overthink it, both of which are then bookended by, look, it's fine, but just don't gaslight us with the trust me bro, it was always a thing, which is basically where I'm at because there's just so many other ways you could write it in. So first up we've got Venom, who says, it's more the issue of how they make these changes and retcons, saying it's always been this way in the case of female custodies. Why not just keep people guessing? Was the Emperor trying to breed a new race of perfect humans, trying to keep it secret, or are the custodies running so short on candidates that they have to take those who could go on to sire other generations of custodian candidates? Just saying it's always been the case is a boring cop-out. Barakai says, good authors work with restrictions set for whatever universe they work on instead of breaking those rules. I want to be clear, this tends not to be really about authors, it's more about sort of campaign supplementary material which just establishes where something is coming in, like a codex or whatever. Anyway, he says, it's kind of disappointing to see them keep introducing new technology to the Imperium after claiming that they can never have anything without writing some sort of story about somebody finding an STC for who knows how many years. Anyone can invent a new 40k vehicle, it takes very little effort to just come up with something new when you don't have to care about the rules of the universe and basically have completely free hand to copy whatever military vehicle you want instead of having to find creative ways to iterate on existing vehicles. I'm not that fussed about it, but you can't exactly praise anybody for taking the path of least resistance at the expense of some sort of vague notion of preserving the integrity of the fantasy world. The Imperium is supposed to be in decline, remember? Does anybody actually remember that in Nottingham? Shrimpanzee, great name, says there's nothing wrong with adding detail where there was none previously, but I think people have a very sharp sense of when the wool is being pulled over their eyes, and you know when the intention is off when you see it, and that is why the examples you stated are noticed by all. If it's natural and well-intentioned, you don't notice it. There's wisdom in the direction of your own attention. Duo says, while I don't mind retcons as there is an in-universe way to explain them, bureaucracy being slow, what the Imperium says is true for them today and could be heresy tomorrow, but some of these retcons are forced and haphazardly done. I can kind of forgive female custodies because the Emperor crafted them and spent time and effort on them, meaning he could use whatever humans he wanted to, and with Space Marines and Primarchs being more rushed and using a template. But the way it was just like, trust me bro, felt bad. Numbskull says, I think there's enough books and lore, you could probably find ways to explain some things. For example, in the book Cadia Stands, as regiments arrive on Cadia, a tank company is sent to a mountain bunker on the complete opposite side to where the fighting is by Creed's orders. Creed himself explains the bunker is actually a giant garage filled with old legendary tanks and a weirdly large amount of Baneblades. You know how when you go through a deceased relative's belongings you tend to find weird stuff? Well, Cadia is a fortress before it's a world. There's bound to be old weird tech. Probably the Dawn and the other new vehicles were uncovered during the siege as the local regiment scrambled to find war resources on the planet. Alternatively, Armageddon had that old superweapon in Hell's Reach. Given their combat style, there may have been other hidden bunkers with old vehicles. Serious, the new vehicles look like bolt-action models, parked away until needed. And this is my whole point. In the 40k galaxy, there is almost an unlimited amount of situational context to which you could discover new things. I have no clue why you would just say, yeah, it was always there, instead of trying to just pinpoint where something came from, because just simply doing so makes everything good. Swordfish Trombone says, I also think STC is really overplayed in 40k lore. STC seems essentially for very complex or high-tech stuff, things human colonists might not have had the capacity to develop themselves for a long time or otherwise risk losing. But do humans need something like this to preserve the arcane knowledge of bladed tools? Simply combustion engines, maybe advanced manufacturing, lasers, armor technology, anything involving space travel or communications or supporting industries. At some point, it gets very stupid with how much we're expected to depend on these STC. This comment is a tricky one because it delves into this issue of STC that I've discovered before, which is that most of the time when we hear about STC, it is for these more complex things. However, the purpose of STC is basically to enable colonists to have whatever they need, no matter how simplistic. Because you may say, well, the production of bladed tools is something humans should know. Yeah, sure, except have you ever had to try and make a bladed tool from scratch, never having known? Especially, we don't know the culture of humans in the dark age of technology. It's not to suggest that you never could do it, but if you can't do it in a critical time where you need that, you may never be surviving to a position where you're actually able to learn that stuff. So the simple thing is, there's a lot of nuance and questions which remain about STC, and that's fine. They are vague in that sense, but at least it's always been this MacGuffin, basically, which people can point to and say, yeah, we found the STC for X, and that's why it's a thing now. And then lastly, just a simple one from Mojave Snake, who says, I accept there are many things in this massive verse that have been around for a long while and can be just highlighted during particular events. But I also see the lazy writing, it's all about execution. And I think this is the crux of the whole issue for me. It's pretty straightforward. It's basically, yes, we want the new stuff, but we also want it to be blended into the world because we are so heavily immersed into it. It's basically as simple as that. So my final thought is really that I'm never going to just say new arrivals are not a good thing. The more depth and expansion we get to 40k, the better, in my opinion. And I think when you're talking about war and civilization on a galactic scale, there really cannot be a limit to what's possible. At the same time, I'm quite strongly not a fan of, and I will say it again, sorry, the trust me bro, they were always there delivery format. I don't know why this has become the norm, and it does cause me unbearable jarring pain. If nothing else, because so many people have said it, it does seem lazy. When you're dealing with world building on the scale of the Imperium, why would you default to it's been in use forever? When you could again just smash out a few plausible ideas. Again, let's just rattle off a couple more off the top of my head. How about somebody unlocking ancient archaeotech in a vault, maybe not an STC, but say there is a system installed in some void ships, hive infrastructure, even a Space Hulk. That discovery allows an adjacent variant of existing armor. I like that because then you have the established format where the existing hardware platform basically never changed, but the underlying principle fits perfectly into the concept that the Imperium just didn't know how to use the vehicle platform to its full potential. That works perfectly. Or you could go with something like a lost format of tech held in stasis by something like the Ordo Reductor, their scary destructive sect of the Mechanicum, or even just a branch of the Inquisition or an isolated Forge world. Similarly, again to that War Master situation, you got a piece of tech which is then authorized for use during a major threat. It's a pretty simple premise, but you can introduce something as if it were new. But you can backfill the lore by creating archive, ancient records, show how it was sealed away for centuries or millennia and forgotten about. Maybe it was used at a certain point and you just forgotten about it. That's totally plausible in the Imperium. Maybe, for example, it was retired after the Age of Apostasy, but is recently seeing now a spreading revival. You could go with a classic. A dead Forge world is scoured by a rogue trader with a Mechanicus entourage. They find a pattern of tech. It's incomplete, but they manage to bridge the gap with some existing STC pattern. That's a little heretic-ish, but nonetheless, in the current pressures of the Imperium, maybe it gets approved for use regardless. Lastly, I think when we're talking about STC, as I said, I think this whole situation, if it continues, where we keep getting things introduced with no background and basically just saying, yeah, it's always been here, that starts to signify the death knell, really, for STC, and at that point there needs to be other questions about what the Mechanicus is doing, what the Administratum is doing, what the Imperial Guard are doing, who is making the decisions about this hardware. This is my point. It's not as simple as just saying, yeah, we accept that this is a new thing. It has implications, and if it keeps happening, they can't just ignore that. They've got to address the situation with the Mechanicus, because we've already had Call being brought up and discussed and debated by other tech priests about what he is doing, and it's like you can't have Call being interrogated by other tech priests and accused of tech heresy for his stuff, and then meanwhile the Imperial Guard's like banging out new vehicles left, right and centre going, yeah, we've always had this, trust us. You know, you can't have it like that. There's just so many ways you could draw new material in without just having to have it like that. There's that planet I described previously who may well not necessarily have an intact STC, but they certainly had an immense library of material, but they knowingly concealed it through deception to the Imperium. And I think from that you could imagine whereby you see some sort of device system vehicle existing even at a small scale, say within a hive city, just being very limited in use for local activity. And because of that, because it's so small scale, it's only understood at a local level. So maybe it is an STC pattern, but it's just kind of confined to that place. And then because of that, its capabilities were never really seen by the wider Imperium, until one day you have a visiting official who's like, what the hell is that? And the locals are like, yeah, we've always had those. They're pretty rough, but they get the job done. Meanwhile, the accompanying tech priest is foaming at the mouth. There's just fun ways you could introduce things and have the story reveal them to us rather than just, yeah, we've always had that. By any standard, you keep it as an STC discovery, but I just like the idea of something being in use and nobody having noticed. That feels very 40k, very Imperium to me. And then when it is discovered, it's fast-tracked for mass production. Again, you then frame this in a lore announcement as it's seen an explosion of use for the Imperial Guard on a scale not seen since the Crusades. You could say it's seen an explosion of use since the fall of Cadia. There's so many ways you could frame it. And none of them bring the same frustration which just comes from it being presented as incomprehensibly having slipped under everybody's radar. And that just feels like a square peg smashed through your proverbial round lore hole. Now, of course, ultimately, it's not the end of the world if something is given a generic, this is what it does and is being deployed commonly in the Guard description. It just feels at this stage, with the wealth of existing lore, it's not hard to find a way to slip new things in and have it still fit comfortably in the world. Maybe we will find out along the line about these new vehicles, more explanations as to how they came to be, and more specifically, why they're only being seen now. But I would love to hear your thoughts about all of this. Is it a big deal for you, or is it a small irritation, or totally irrelevant? Do you think I'm making a lot of something about nothing? Tell me in the comments below. As always, I greatly appreciate all of your support here on the channel, and for myself, I do apologise for the ongoing slower delivery of content. Nothing's going away, I've got many plans, but at the moment, life is life, and I'm surviving on a couple of hours sleep here and there. So please hit the like if you enjoyed, and I will, as always, see you all in the next one.